So here we are in Marvelous Designer, and I just want to give you a brief overview of the interface before we get started. So we've got two different views here. We have the 3D view on one side, and we have the 2D view on the other. And they've also organized the toolbars up here so that the tools that we'll be using in the 2D pattern window are generally on this side, and likewise for the 3D view over here. So in the 3D view, you can use your mouse to navigate around this, just like you would in another 3D package. So the controls here are right click to rotate. I've got holding in the mouse button lets you pan. And then if you scroll the mouse wheel, you can zoom in and out of your scene. And then over here in the 2D view, get similar controls. You can hold down the mouse button to pan around, left and right, up and down. And then you have the mouse wheel again, scrolling to zoom in and out. Okay. Apart from that, we have a couple other things over here. We've got an object browser, which stores your different fabric types. It stores your buttons and your stitching, a lot of more detail-oriented things that we'll get onto once we get into the actual garment creation. But then we also have the property editor tab down here, which is going to give you a bunch of different settings for your fabric and different settings for the particle distance, the resolution of your fabric, different settings like that. We'll go into that in just a moment. But first thing we want to do actually is import our model that we exported from DAZ. So let's go over here to File, go down to Import OBJ, and we're just going to bring in that A pose, that initial pose that we created and exported from DAZ. So just hit Open, and we'll keep all these settings the same. Just make sure that your scale is set to centimeters. Hit OK. And as you can see, it's dropped it down into our scene with these funny green boxes on it. So to turn that off, we actually just need to go over to this setting over here. Just click these Show Arrangement Points, which will turn off the blue dots, and this one, which will turn off those bounding volumes. Okay, so now we've got the model just like we had it in DAZ, and then we can see a little ghosted representation of that over the 2D view. So this is going to be good for estimating sizes of your garments and just getting everything set up properly before we start to arrange it in the 3D view. So I think what would be good now is to just get you started with how fabric simulation works, as that is the main focus of this program. So over here in the 2D view, we're just going to grab a rectangle tool, and we're just going to drag out, click and drag, to create just a large piece of fabric. And then we're going to arrange it in the 3D view, and we're going to drop it on our character, just so we can see how fabric interacts with the model that we imported. Okay, so let's zoom out here a little bit. And we can see a representation of our cloth in the 3D view, as well as the 2D view. Now, if I make manipulations to the scale and the shape of this, if I grab this point and I just bring it down to create a triangle, you can see that it's in shape. So whatever changes I make over here to the shape of this will be populated over to the 3D view side. However, position and rotation are not linked. So depending on where this is placed, it will not change anything over here. So that's something to keep in mind, and something that can be a bit confusing for beginners for Marvelous Designer. So let's just position this. Just click on this garment, and you can get this little gizmo that pop up. It gives you all these different rings, similar to what we saw in DAZ, where you can rotate your piece of fabric. So let's just position this over our character's head, like that. We'll just scale it up a little bit. And then we're just going to simulate, just to see what happens. So if you go over here to the 3D view side, and you get this little arrow at the top, which is to simulate, turn your simulation on or off. You can think about this as adding gravity or putting pressure on your fabric to bring it down to the ground. So as you can see, as we turn the simulation on, it's dropping our fabric and it's colliding and reacting to the avatar that we have here. And it will also react with the ground plane as we have the floor turned on. So it's quite a large piece of fabric, so this is going to take some time. But you can see really beautiful wrinkles and folds all over. And then what's nice is you have an interactive viewport here. So you see when you hover over this, you get this little hand, which lets you grab a piece of fabric, and then you can manipulate the position in real time. This is really cool, but I tend not to use this as it can be quite frustrating to be working with, especially when you have complicated pieces of clothing that are quite high resolution. This becomes quite slow. So I would avoid moving things around like this as much as possible, but we'll go into that a bit more when we get into pattern creation. Okay. So let's undo that. And then we'll just move our garment piece up, our fabric piece. And then what we're going to be creating now is a basic curtain, like a window curtain or some sort of cloth backdrop that you might see in a photo studio. Okay, so let's delete our model for now, actually. So just click on it and hit delete. So we don't need that. And we've got this large piece of fabric here. And we want to keep this top piece frozen and have the rest of the fabric draped down like a curtain would. So as you can see, if I simulate this now, it just simply falls straight to the floor. And I mean, this might be nice if you were making a rug, something like that, something on the floor, but we want it to be hanging in midair. So let's do that now. And the way that I like to do that, and just as a good example for how sewing works in this program, we're just going to copy Control C and paste Control V and click. And then we're just going to scale this down. We don't need this to be so big. Okay. And that piece is up here. So we're going to pull that down and align it with that first piece of fabric that we made. Okay. All right. So then what we want to do is we want to attach these two pieces together with sewing. And now that's done over here in the 2D view. So if you click this piece here, that's going to be N on your keyboard for segment sewing. And then if we hover over any of these segments in the 2D view, or in the 3D view for that matter, it'll give us this highlighted blue indication of what we're going to be sewing. So if we click once, and then click another time on this other segment here, it's going to create sewing that connects these two pieces. And you can see in the 3D a really great visual representation of what's going on. So there's these two separate pieces, and you can see all these red lines connecting these two. And that's just telling you how these pieces are sewn together. And as you can see right now, we've got a proper sewing going because we have straight lines across. So if I were to delete this and do it improperly, and you can see there's this little notch here. So when you're sewing, you always want to make sure they're on the same side. Because if you don't, you're going to have something like this, where you get this strange crisscross sewing pattern. And when you simulate, it's going to do all sorts of weird stuff. You can see it's not aligning properly, and it's getting all tangled up. And that'll cause a lot of problems later on. So let's delete that. And then resew this properly, making sure that the notch is on the same side. Okay, so we've got this straight across, and then we hit simulate. That's a space bar on your keyboard. It's going to connect these up, essentially fusing these together and having this fall as one single piece. Right? You can see this is what the sewing is like. All right. So what we want to do is we want this to drape across the ground, but we want to keep this piece at the top still, almost as if it was a curtain rod holding up a window curtain. So the way that I like to do that is to just freeze this piece. So if you hit Control K on your keyboard, or you can right click and go up here to freeze, that's going to freeze this piece and it's going to turn it blue to indicate it's frozen. So when we simulate now, let's see what happens. As you can see, the sewing is two pieces, but this piece that we created and froze up here is not moving at all. So now we've got this beautiful draping. It's reacting with the floor. And we can use our hand tool to just pull it around in our scene. So this is the very basics of sewing patterns in Marvelous Design, something that we're going to expand upon in the next sections. Okay, and so I want to make this more like a curtain. So how could I do that? Well, you noticed here we have this even sewing lengths. These are exactly the same length. So we have this really smooth look to our fabric here. So if we wanted to have more wrinkles like you would on a window curtain, all we need to do is we just need to increase the size of this piece here. Okay, so let's reposition this. We can actually just right click it and reset the 3D arrangement, and that'll remove any deformations from the simulation. And as you can see now that I've extended this piece out, you can see these angles on the side here, and that's just showing us that these line lengths are no longer the same. So if we match these up, you can see this is much shorter, or just a little bit shorter. Just to explain better. So you can see we're sewing a larger piece onto a smaller piece, and then we'll see what happens when we simulate that. Okay. So now you can see this much larger piece is being squished together and sewn onto the smaller piece, thus creating these intermediate wrinkles in between like this. Just like that. Okay. And what's great about the interactive nature, again, is that you can just kind of drag this around. You can get real-time feedback of what's going on with your fabric. And then you can also manipulate the 2D view. Say I wanted this to be a bit shorter, and those will actually instantly appear over here in the 3D view as well. So if I wanted more of that short curtain shape, I could just reduce the length here and then hit resimulate. And this will fall back. Pull it a little bit more, like that. And again, the power of Marvelous Designer, how quick this is to just get these beautiful wrinkles in an interactive way that's really simple. Okay. That's great. So let's look at one more thing. So if we go over here and similar to how we were adjusting the avatar settings, we're going to go over here to our cloth appearance and click on this one. Now this is going to show us the topology of the piece of fabric that we created. And as you can see, it's made of all these tiny little triangles. And the size of these triangles, the distance between these points here, is controlled by the particle distance. And the particle distance is essentially the resolution of your fabric. It controls how much detail you can see in your pieces of fabric. So if we just click on this, and we go over here to our property on the right side, and we look down in simulation properties, we'll see particle distance. So if I were to increase this to something like 40, you'll be able to see that it vastly increases the size of the polygons. And thus, if I remove the lines here, you can see a much lower resolution fabric. This looks a lot more 3D, a lot less realistic than what we had previously. Like many things, the smaller we make this, the higher resolution it is, and the more time it's going to take to simulate. So that's always something to keep in mind when you're adjusting your particle distance. You want to find that nice balance between something that looks really good and something that's actually simulates quick enough so that you can work with it properly. So let's just reset this, resimulate again, and we can see we're back to 20, a particle distance of 20, this detail back. So let's just decrease this down to 10 and see what happens here. So we can see it's really reduced the size of our triangles. And you can see the difference between this particle size of 20 up here and the particle size of 10 that we assigned for this larger piece. So if we just remove lines again and simulate, we can see it's a much slower in response time for the simulation. But we're also getting a lot of nice micro details in the wrinkles down here, as well as up here at the top. So it's all about finding that balance. Okay. All right. So we can export that now if you want. We can use this a little bit later on. I'm going to save this. I'm just going to call this curtain. And then let's just bring our model back in here. So if we go back up to import OBJ, and we'll grab that A pose again. Let's bring that into our scene. Okay, so this is the basis of what we're going to be doing for all of the fabric manipulation techniques. It's all about creating different shapes of fabric and then sewing them together. So let's take a brief detour into fabric patterns now, and we'll look at how we can use those to inform what we'll be doing for actual garment creation when we jump back into Marvelous Designer. So let's take a quick break, and I'll show you a little bit more about fabric patterns.